This is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas R. Verney. My guest today is Rabbi Jonathan Duker, who grew up near Philadelphia, attended Yehivat Reishit Yerushalayim in the old city of Jerusalem, earned his BA and MA from Yeshiva University, was ordained as rabbi by Yeshivat Chovevei Torah in New York. I'm not sure about the pronunciation.
Yeah, that's good. You got it. You nailed it.
I got it. Okay. In 2004, he emigrated to Israel and subsequently received a degree in education from Herzog College. He currently serves as an Israel Studies Educator at the Alexander Muss High School in Israel. He is Rabbinic guide for Camp Yavneh in New Hampshire and volunteers for the Jewish Marriage Department for the Tzohar Rabbinical Organization. Rabbi Duker lives in Beit Shemesh with his wife Susan and their 4 children. He is the author of The Spirits Behind the Law, the Talmudic Scholars, published in 2007, as well as other Talmud-based writings. Welcome, Rabbi Jonathan Duker. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. I apologize for the mouthful of many of my alma maters, but you got everything on the nose.
Okay, on the nose. So glad you could join us. May I call you Jonathan or John? What is?
Yeah, John is fine.
John is fine. So in your book that I just referred to, you say the scholars of the Talmud and Midrash had an immeasurable impact on Judaism. Perhaps we can start by you explaining the meaning of the words Talmud and Midrash for those of our listeners who are not familiar with that. So what is meant by Talmud and Midrash?
Sure. So the short answer is the Talmud and Midrash.
Take your time. Don't give me the short answer.
Oh, no, the long one's coming next. It's educational for life. Short answer, then the long answer. So it's records of discussions that were carried out by thousands of rabbis over the course of hundreds of years. They were largely taking place between the 2nd and 9th centuries in the land of Israel and Persia. So you're talking about oral traditions of discussions and later people getting together discussing those discussions and discussions about the discussions. And this all is happening or developing orally over the course of hundreds of years. And both named figures who are part of these discussions and sort of anonymous people who are part of these discussions over the time get inserted into these long traditions. The longer answer is I just want to take a step back and give a little scope of where we are in terms of Jewish history and world history when this happens.
Yeah.
So the Jewish biblical narrative ends around the 6th century BCE. At that time, there is a newly built temple in Jerusalem. There is a smallish Jewish community, mostly centered around Jerusalem. And that's where the Jewish Bible's narrative ends. The Christian Bible picks up a little bit after that with the Gospels, but that's the Jewish Bible ends around the 6th century BCE. What happened historically after that is Alexander the Great comes and conquers Jerusalem. We have the Hasmonean Revolt, which is more popularly known as the Maccabees, the Hanukkah story, which was a Jewish revolt which replaced the Greeks and had a Jewish monarchy. Eventually, this dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees dynasty, sort of dies out, and there's Roman rule of the land of Israel. At this point, you have famous figures like King Herod being a king. This is the period where Jesus starts his ministry. We have in the time following Jesus, now we're talking about sort of the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century, 2 failed Jewish revolts against the Romans, which included the destruction of the Second Temple and sort of the reorientation of the Jewish population, first out of Jerusalem into northern Israel, and then continuing to sort of leave the land of Israel and to head eastward into the Persian Empire. So the Talmud is starting with the Talmud and a subsect of it called the Mishnah, which maybe we'll talk about later, is sort of a reorientation, intellectual and spiritual reorientation for the Jewish people with this new reality that they're no longer an independent kingdom, but they're either a vassal state or living completely as guests in foreign lands. And during this period, a lot of the religious principles have to be explored, lacking a temple and lacking a monarchy and lacking a strong base. And these discussions, which involve both legal aspects and philosophical aspects, are, as I said before, discussed in many contexts over many years, and eventually are put into these large books, which are sometimes certain sections referred to the Talmud, or other books which are referred to as a Midrash.
Okay, so what are some of the subjects that these scholars are discussing?
So the interesting thing about I'll really focus now on the Talmud more because it's just easier if we wrap our head around one work, is that the books are, as I said, the records of discussions and discussions about discussions. And just as when you sit down at dinner with somebody, you might start in one place and jump to another topic, another topic, another topic. That's the way the Talmud flows. So the topics covers everything under the sun. So really the official subject matter of Talmudic tracts are generally legally based, either regarding Jewish holidays, torts and damages law, laws of purity, laws of marriage and divorce. Those are sort of the subjects that sort of kick off the discussions. But from there, it can go into other legal areas, or it could also go into philosophical discussions, theological discussions, personal stories, medical advice, jokes. These are all things that just happen by way of conversation in the Talmud. So really it covers anything that any Jew might have spoken about over the course of about 7 centuries. It can find in the Talmud.
So who would write all this stuff down? Like, would the scholars themselves write it down, or did they have scribes?
That's a great question, and we don't really know. We do not know when the Talmud was first written down. There are lots of theories. We know that it was written down by the 10th century. The earliest record we have of a Talmud, of a written Talmud, is in the 10th century, where the rabbis in Persia were sending a version to the communities in Spain, the Jewish communities in Spain. Were there versions of the Talmud written before that? It's possible. It's possible that there were, certain sections were written. There were texts. I mentioned before something called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is actually the first section, what later became the sort of the opening salvos, the discussions of the Talmud. Those were edited into a sort of a final form in this all the way back in the 2nd century. But we don't know to this day whether it was written down in the 2nd century, or whether all this were just oral traditions and just memorized in schools, which were called yeshivot or yeshivas in the English plural, and just memorized by people with phenomenal memories, and then eventually written down, or they were written down piecemeal along the way. But until we find a 1,500-year-old document, we're just not going to know the answer to these questions.
So this was, of course, before the printing press, right?
Yeah, the printing press changes everything.
Right.
So you did have handwritten Talmuds before the printing press. After the printing press, it gets much more centralized, and eventually, by the time we get to the 20th century, we'll say there's almost a standard Talmud text that's going to happen, which can only happen with the printing press. So this is in addition to the dynamicism that would happen to any text-free printing press. When you have every scribe writing it down on their own or copying from somebody else, which would lead to much more dynamic text. But even that was at the tail end of this long oral traditions. So we do have variances in different versions of the Talmud, and it's possible that different rabbis or different schools or yeshivot had slightly different versions of the Talmud. These are all questions that Talmud scholars deal with.
So in your book, I believe you write about 15 scholars. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
So how did you, I mean, I'm sure there were more than 15 scholars. So how did you select those particular 15?
So there's definitely a lot more than 15. And the challenge I'll just take a step back and describe what I did in my book, which is the book is, I wrote it 15 years ago. And this is my first podcast about it, because I don't think podcasting existed when the book was published. But the idea of the book was to come up with sort of biographies, and maybe later we'll touch on some of the challenges of doing that. But one of the major challenges in writing these biographies of the rabbis of the Talmud is that, as I said, the topics jump from topic to topic very quickly, and these conversations are constantly moving. So there's not like a section, I want about this rabbi, I can look a book and find all the stories about this rabbi or biography. What it is that over the thousands of pages of the Talmud, it's to sort of collate the different places where this rabbi is mentioned. That's sort of task number one, to sort of put together the body of work and just to collect it. That's like a bibliographical endeavor. And then once that's done, it would have to be, I had to felt like there's some common thread in the narrative that would make it into a story. This isn't an encyclopedia. It doesn't have all the facts. What the premise is that while these stories appear in different places, the living tradition, the living memories that the Talmud scholars had about their predecessors, they had specific images in mind about what their personalities were like, what their theology was. And what I'm trying to do is put together a cohesive picture and all these various stories of what this person might have believed, what he lived, and what the rabbis saw him as the lessons that they can learn from this person. So it's a combination of having enough material, and the material, in my mind at least, coalescing into some sort of story that I could tell the public.
So among these 15 people, 15 scholars, which one, if there is one, which one sort of stands out for you? Which one is the most? Which one is
right.
sort of the most, I don't know, brilliant, or most, the one who impressed you the most personally?
Wow. So that is, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of the most amazing story, and this is not a highly original sentiment, but is that the rabbi named Rabbi Akiba is sort of his story and his narrative is the most exceptional narrative. He is somebody who grew up, he was ignorant for large part of the Jewish tradition, likely illiterate. He was a shepherd, which in the sort of Talmudic narrative, people who are shepherds or from rural areas are assumed to be sort of a lower class, illiterate. The Talmud rabbis tend to be in more urban environments. Right. And he had, at a later stage in his life, after meeting the love of his life, and he decides, and he marries the love of his life. His name was Rachel or Rachel. Her father disowns him, disowns her, disowns him because of his ignorance. They live on their own, and he decides.
Nothing has changed, has it?
Right, right. It's I mean, hopefully, I mean, my book is only relevant insofar as people see relevancy in it. So if all these things went away, then there wouldn't be much purpose to rehashing these stories. But these are real things, and it's real tension, and he decides to educate himself, and he at a late age, some stories have him going to school with his son, like sort of going to first grade with his son and learning how to read and staying in the same classroom. Yeah. But he becomes one of the greatest rabbis of the generation, and not only one of the greatest rabbis, but also one of the most creative, which seems to speak to sort of an aspect that as an outsider and coming to it late in the game, he had something to contribute that the establishment did it. And he becomes sort of a major teacher. How much he influenced later Judaism is an interesting question, which is one of the big meta questions in the Talmud, which is how much, when somebody says something that sounds radical, are they saying something new and radical, or are they saying something that's already was part of the tradition, they're just framing it in a new way? And that's one of these questions that, again, scholars deal with. But on the face of it, Rabbi Akiva, his interpretation of the biblical text seems to be the most dynamic, the most radical, and he became the most respected rabbi of his generation. And so that's just a amazingly inspiring story to read through.
So would his work or any of the other scholars' work also have had an impact on the non-Jewish world?
That's a great question. So I'm going to break this down into two different answers.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is the Talmud. It's a hard book to read. It's a real slog. I mean, even if your Aramaic is fluent, and Aramaic was sort of the lingua franca of that part of the world, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. These are recordings of conversations with no punctuation. It's really, really deep, often deeply immersed in legal terms and self-referential. That almost assumption is that anybody who's learning the Talmud is already familiar with all the major concepts of the Talmud. It's very, very difficult to read, and the Talmud itself as a book did not really spread to the larger world, unlike the previous Jewish literary creation, the Bible. Right? The Bible became the most popular book in the history of the world. The Talmud largely stayed as a Jewish-only endeavor, and therefore the rabbis of the Talmud were not as well known to the larger world. But I will say that a lot of their teachings would have spread through Jesus, meaning Jesus is before Rabbi Akiva, but he's after some other rabbis whose biographies are in the story in the Talmud. There's a chapter in my book about the Rabbi Hillel, who at the end of his life might have been Jesus, might have been a kid, and like the Bible, like just as Jesus's teachings spread the teachings of the Bible to the larger world, a lot of what he said may have come from rabbis or hearing from rabbis. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus is asked what the most important biblical verses are, one of them, he says, his number 2 on his list is love your neighbor as yourself. And this is similar to Hillel, who lived a little bit before him, the Jewish days Hillel, that when somebody said, what's the most important thing in Judaism? He said, the verse, love your neighbor as yourself. And he formulates something very similar to Jesus' golden rule, right? Jesus' golden rule is that do unto others what you would have them do to you. Hillel has a phrase which is very similar, which is that which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. So it's the same thing, the inverse and the negative.
Right.
But so did Jesus or his family or his teachers learn from Hillel? It's very, very possible. And so a lot of things that are in the Gospels may have come from this rabbinic world. Also, it's also worth mentioning Islam and Muhammad, again, that a lot of Jewish ideas spread to much of the world through the spread of Islam. And there in Surah 32 of the Quran, there's a phrase, whoever saves a life as if he saved the entire world. And this is actually, well before the Quran, it's in the Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin, which deals with courts, and when it's talking about dangers of capital punishment. It talks about whoever saves the life of a person as if he saved the entire world. And this gets quoted almost verbatim in the Quran. So these teachings did spread out. They're not, though largely in the mid ages and even nowadays, not a lot of people will know who Rabbi Akiva or who Hillel is. They might be familiar with some of their ideas.
Very interesting. So just to change the subject a little bit, you also teach at the Sadie Rennard Women's Institute for Torah Studies. Do you still teach there, or what? Or is that
so I had to take a little break because of my schedule got a little crazy recently, but it's a very interesting thing, which is it's called Matan over here in Israel, and it's a women's Torah study organization, and which is an interesting idea to start with because women's Torah study on a serious level is a relatively recent idea. There was a lot, even though there's always been exceptions, and in my book there is a chapter we talk about Bruria, who was a female scholar in the 2nd century or 3rd century. So there always were exceptions to the rule. As a whole, women were not encouraged to be educated, and even after the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution in recent times, when women were being educated in Jewish communities, they often would have a secular education that well outpaced the Jewish education. And really in the past century or even less, there's been a movement towards having first-class Jewish education for women. And one of the interesting things that I did in Matan, in the Sadie Renner Women Institute for Jewish Studies, was I taught a Talmud class, a daily Talmud class. I wasn't teaching every single day. I was in rotation with other people, including my brother, who, and it's this interesting idea that the Talmud is this huge, huge work, over 2,000 two-sided pages, which are called folios. And there is about 100 years ago, there's the idea that, well, let's do a cycle that every day people will study one page of the Talmud, and about every 7.5 years, we'll finish the entire thing. And this idea caught on, and it's pretty popular within Talmud study circles. I say that most people who study Talmud study it in this fashion, sort of one page a day, a slow slog to the finish line, where every 7.5 years you finish the whole thing. And I taught a class like this to a group of women, which in Orthodox Jewish circles is not so common. There's probably maybe dozens of such classes in the world, if that. And we finished a few times, and incredible people in the group. There was a woman who escaped pre-war Europe on the she left on the Kinder transport, where she was sent to the countryside in England. She later came to she stayed in England. She got married. Her husband was a Talmud scholar. She never studied Talmud in her life. And when he passed away, she must have been in her 70s or 80s, she started and joined this class, and she's already finished the Talmud twice. And that was it was a great group to learn with. And I hope to join them on temporary hiatus, just because of schedule conflicts. But I hope to join with them again soon.
Sounds really interesting. So, but you have also taught Talmud to male students, right?
Yes.
So, have you noticed any difference in terms of how men and women react? Is there any difference?
Okay, so let's start with going back a little bit to this sociology of Orthodox Judaism that I referenced before. That you have this trend that this idea that men should be learning Talmud and women in general either shouldn't be, or even if they could be, it's not really expected of all women the way it's expected of all men in the Orthodox community. So when men study Talmud in the Orthodox community, it's almost the default that this is what's expected. And for women, it's a self-selected group. And for me, that's already a huge difference. I'm a little bit of an elitist by nature, and it's to have a group of people. These are the 10 women out of the community of thousands that have chosen to join this class. It's very different. So that was to have that sort of self-selection, the process. Also, less preconceived notions. I think for Orthodox men who've been studying Talmud their entire lives, they sort of assume certain things, have ideas that they heard over the course of their lives from elementary school and onwards. Often Talmud started to be studied as early as maybe about 5th grade or grade 5, as you would say, or some thereabouts, which is a very young age to start something. And sometimes we start learning something very young. We accept certain strange things about it that we don't think about. And with the group of women, we're often hearing things for the first time. It was great to see, you're more able to point out certain interesting things that sometimes men don't always notice. Besides that,
could you give an example of that?
Okay, so I think there's a lot of the idea of who is speaking in a Talmudic text is something that are questions I got asked by a women's group often, that I did not get. I got those questions less by men, meaning, again, the way the Talmudic narrative works is that you'd have a conversation with rabbis, and that would be discussed by other people later, and that would be discussed by other people later. So that some of these rabbis have names, some of these rabbis are just anonymously in. And to follow the flow of who's speaking when is very complicated. And I think in my experience, a lot of lifelong Talmud studiers that I've learned with, the way they dealt with the question is sort of by ignoring it. They're just like, oh, this is the Talmud talking. This is just, and they're not thinking about, while somebody who's approaching it maybe for the first time, be much more sensitive to, wait, what's going on? Who's commenting on what? And and me, as somebody who likes to think historically, that's a very important question. So I also had I've also taught women Talmud in other contexts, and I worked for years in gap year programs for students who come sort of after high school, before university, and was able to teach Talmud also to beginners, but on a more intensive level there. And I've noticed these same sort of trends in general. I was knowing that this isn't now my idea, but there has been a sociological study done recently about women's Talmud study and if it's different than men. And I didn't do the study. This isn't my field. This is just something the study, just what I read there, that the author claimed that when men are reading the text together, and they're difficult texts, so you have to really parse out the words, they tend to be more combative with one another, while women, when they're studying together, tend to be more collaborative. I can't vouch for this firsthand, but this is what the most recent study, or I think the only study ever written on this topic, has said.
Interesting. Not surprising, but interesting. Yes.
Right.
So what made you choose this particular vocation? In other words, why become a rabbi?
So I only ended up becoming a rabbi because I love to study.
Yeah.
And so I love to study. And so after I graduated, I finished my undergrad with a BA in history. And rather than going to all the lucrative jobs that a BA in history can get, I stayed in school. And academically, I went for a master's degree in medieval Jewish history. And then I went to rabbinical school, which an Orthodox rabbinical school is largely text study. The school that I went to, which you mentioned, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, does have more of an emphasis on things like pastoral counseling and rabbinics than other traditional yeshivot or rabbinical schools. But really, the bulk of the day is studying text, and just my love of learning sort of kept me in school. And then what do you do when you and then eventually want to share what I learned. And so I really wanted to be an educator. I felt a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of being a rabbi, especially when I was younger. But later in life, I've accepted that there's a lot of roles that are traditionally reserved for rabbis that I can really contribute and help people. So in recent years, moving more in that direction to, I'm still, education is still primarily what I do, but I have been spending a lot more time in more traditional rabbinic roles when I feel that I could be of use to people and help them.
So just to accentuate that, like which part of your job as a rabbi do you enjoy the most?
So so I really love when I can help marry tradition to what people need as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things that I do, one of my rabbinic things that I do is, as you mentioned at the outset, I volunteer for an organization called Tzohar. Tzohar is an interesting organization, and what it does is that in Israel has a strange, it might be strange to North American listeners, but it would be very normal to people who live in the Middle East, that there's a law which goes back to Ottoman times that a person of a certain faith group can only be married, their wedding can only be officiated by a cleric of their faith group.
Hmm.
So a Muslim has to go to a Muslim, and a Muslim has to go to imam, and a Christian has to go to a priest. There's subdivisions based on various, different groups and different sects. But and so a Jew in Israel has to get married by a rabbi, and for various reasons in Israel, it's specifically an Orthodox rabbi. Now, uh, most Jews in Israel do not identify as Orthodox, and this could create some tension that this is the most important moment of their lives and a very meaningful time, and it should be very meaningful and personal. And they're often faced with a set of rituals or traditions that they may not be fully conversant in or understanding or appreciate. And what Sohar does is we try to bridge this gap by having rabbis volunteer to do weddings for anybody, any Jew who asks who needs to be married by a rabbi, and try as much as we can to give the wedding personalization and meaning to individuals while still remaining within the context of tradition. And that creates all sorts of really fun challenges, which is, it's part interpretation of the tradition and part understanding and getting to know a couple and what they're looking for. And that's something that's extremely meaningful when we take a couple from a place where they're nervous about their wedding. And, when they say, oh, you have to talk to the rabbi and they have to meet me and they're nervous, oh, what's the rabbi going to say? To having a really meaningful, to having their wedding ceremony being as meaningful as it should be. And so that's a very, very special thing for me.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Now, another one of your activities, I understand, is taking students from Israel to Poland on an education trip. Are you
That
still
is
engaged in that?
okay. So that is almost it's a little different.
Yeah.
It's what I do in my main job, my full-time job now, is I educate students from outside of Israel, whether they're from North America, from Australia, South America, who they're high school students who come to Israel for a certain amount of time,
Mhm.
and I teach them about Jewish history. And when I teach them about Jewish history, it's a combination of classroom learning, but it's also we do it on site. I mean, in Israel, you can go all sorts of archaeological sites and historical sites and teach them about the story of our people. A component of this program was before COVID and will be again soon, take certain groups to go to Poland as well as part of this trip. Poland has played and was the ground for the biggest or one of the biggest events in Jewish history. And to take these students to Poland as part of them exploring their Jewish story, yeah, that's something that is part of my job. And I'll be heading to Poland Sunday night in Poland in January. So it's going to be a trip.
So when you go to Poland, do you also go to Auschwitz concentration camp?
Yes, we go to Auschwitz extermination death camp, and the curriculum could change, but it involves mostly places of tragedy. Concentration camps, extermination camps, various massacre sites. There was a lot of Jewish life in Poland, and one could spend time in Poland talking about the living Jewish community that was there, and that's definitely part of it. But for most Jewish people nowadays, Poland's significance is really focused on that window of time when so much murder and death and suffering for our people.
What sort of reactions do you get from the students who are with you on those trips?
So I haven't been with this group yet because I've,
Oh,
this is actually a new job. I just joined about a month ago. So, and because of COVID, it's been, Poland's been off the list for a while. Um, but I do know from other trips and other groups that, um, look, everybody's different. People have different reactions. It's very, in the worst case scenario is people just feel despondent and depressed seeing so much suffering. Um, but often that idea of it also comes with sometimes a sense of identification. And a lot of people, even when there is when it's an identification through something negative, like seeing the suffering of the Holocaust or discrimination, it can strengthen their identity in a way that can make their lives a lot more meaningful.
so uh, being a rabbi, would you call yourself an Orthodox rabbi?
Yeah, if you want to get specific about it, the term that I identify by is religious Zionist, but Orthodox is close enough.
Okay, okay. So as a man who believes in God, right?
Yes.
How do you keep your faith in a benevolent God after Auschwitz?
So that's a very, very good question. And I want to say what I like about the question so much, meaning I think it's a theological, philosophical, dry question, abstract. It's not the strongest question because we just don't have enough information about how God interacts with the world, right? God does things, people do things, believing people, we still have some sort of interaction, and we don't have enough information to really answer that in a real way. But what the reason the question is so great is because religious people have a relationship with God, and when you're in a place like Auschwitz, or when you see evil in the world, there is an emotional response, which is very real and very, very valid. And even if we could say theologically, we don't understand the way God works, we don't understand various things, that's in a real relationship. That's to poo-poo a question like this. It means you're not really engaged in the relationship. And it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to struggle with how God could be in this world and these things can happen. I'll tell you that there's a rabbi, his name was Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro. He was a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust, and he would give sermons every Sabbath afternoon to his followers. He was a Hasidic rabbi, so to various Hasidic Jews. And after the Sabbath, he would write them down, and they were hid in a big metal milk container and buried under the Warsaw Ghetto. And after the war, these were found, and they were later published. And myself and a group of friends, every Sabbath afternoon, we study his writings. Not his writings, his speeches that he gave. And he talks about, in one of his speeches, he says that the Holocaust is God's punishment. God has been involved in so much evil in the world. He has to be punished, and the Holocaust is him being punished. It's a very heavy idea, and it's a lot to wrap one's head around. But I think what he was trying to say on a certain level is that we're saying, okay, God, where are you? But God is there. God is there. God is maybe suffering. God is part of it. He's very involved. He's involved in our world. How is he involved? He's not always involved as Superman coming out of a cave and saving the day, but God is present. And in the Holocaust, God was present. And where the God was present, he made him present as one of the victims as well as watching people suffer. I think in terms of relating to God, that idea helps me a lot.
But isn't God supposed to be like all powerful? Could he not intervene if he wanted to?
It's possible. Meaning in our in both Jewish tradition and in lived reality, if you're a believer, there's there are times we believe God intervenes, and there's also a belief that people have large control over this universe. One of the major changes, a movement out of Talmudic Judaism in recent times has been in the idea. The Talmud was very, very hesitant about people trying to influence major political events too much. In terms of, for example, you could say, well, if the Jews were exiled from Israel or began to leave Israel during these various persecutions in the 2nd century and going on to the 1st century, the 2nd century, why did it take them so long to come back? It wasn't until the Zionist movement in the 20th century, after untold persecutions, even before the Holocaust, the amount of persecutions of Jews in Christian lands, and less so, but still very strongly, often in Muslim lands. Why didn't they come back before? And a lot of it was a sense that, these major historical events are in God's hands. The Talmud has a narrative where they say that God made a promise. He made the Jews swear that they're not going to come back to Israel till it's the time. When's going to be the time? Presumably when God does some sort of miracle. So we're handing everything over to the divine. With the events of the 20th century, the various persecutions in the early 20th century, but then the climax of the Holocaust, and then the state of Israel, which was started by people who largely rejected this Talmudic ethos and felt that humans have to have an obligation to take a larger responsibility in their history. And where I said before, I'm a religious Zionist. A religious Zionist is living a little bit of both these worlds. We're religious, we believe God is in the world, but we're Zionists is that we do have a huge a belief that people control their destiny. And how exactly this interacts, we don't know. But the idea that God can come in and do whatever he wants is not the ethos of my that I personally have, and one I think that recent history throws into question.
So when we pray, when any religious people of any religion pray, it's usually asking for something of God, right? Please, heal my wife's cancer or whatever, right? So does that sort of not imply that God could intervene? Otherwise, what's the point of praying?
That's a great question. So this is something that the Jewish philosophers have struggled about over forever. You asked me about all religious people. I don't want to speak for other religions. I can't even speak for all of Judaism, but I'll speak for my understanding of Judaism. There's a passage. The way that I understand it is that there are times where God intervenes. There are times when God doesn't. Now, what are the percentages? So if you want, there is one source that kind of has a percentage, and which is there's a passage in Maimonides, who's the greatest of Jewish philosophers, in his book Guide for the Perplexed, where he understands, it's unclear what Maimonides is saying. It's a very, very difficult book to read, but one of the commentators on Maimonides says that God listens to prayers about 1 in 1,000 times. Okay, so what's the percentage on that? 0.1%. So I don't know exactly what percentage is. Maybe it's much higher than that. Maybe it's lower than that. There is this, we do believe God is in the world. We do believe that that we have initiative plays a role. And when somebody prays to God because he needs something or she needs something, I think most religious people understand that they hope God comes to their aid, but they're also doing it not because they're hoping God will give them what they want. It's just being part of the relationship. And it's the language that we have to reach out. The relationship and the fact that we turn to God for help, just as a child falls down and bangs her head and she's crying and then calls for her mother. She already fell. There's nothing the mother can do anymore. But we want God in our lives. And one of the ways is by framing it in this way that we're asking for something, even though I don't think any religious person is sure, I don't want to, again, I think I'm over speaking by saying any religious, but I don't understand how a person could be sure that God will answer or what the role is. Clearly, we have a world here that on a certain level runs without God's direct intervention. We also, as religious people, believe that God is in the world. And that's an interesting push and pull.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for that. We had a few exchanges of letters before you came on this podcast. And in the last letter, in your response to my question, whether you have any hobbies or play a musical instrument, you answered, I don't have any serious hobbies, casually play basketball, guitar, some other things, but not as defining aspects of my identity. I love that phrase. I love that phrase. Being a writer, I'm always looking for interesting phrases, and I'm afraid
it's yours. Take it.
I'm going to steal that from you. I love that phrase, defining aspects of my identity. So, what would you say are the defining aspects of your identity?
Oh, okay. So the defining aspect of my identity. So I have my family, which is me as a husband and as a father. I have four boys, and that's something defining aspect of my identity. I'm a rabbi of religious Zionist rabbi who also really wants to spread Jewish teachings to the larger Jewish community. Actually, a big change in my life in the past 6 months even has been I've gone from working exclusively within the Orthodox community to working exclusively out of the Orthodox community. And the idea that I believe that the Jewish people is a faith, we're also a family, and we really have to do more, all of us, to communicate better between our family members. And that's something that's very, very important part of my identity. Other aspects, okay, we can throw in mediocre pickup basketball player, occasional runner, etc. But I think those are the things that are really when that are the most important to me are the fact that is learning and translating and interpreting the tradition for ways for people that'll be meaningful and useful for them in their lives.
You. So you must have spent a great deal of time learning Aramaic and trying to interpret the Talmud, right? So
Yes.
are you going to use that knowledge for another project in the future? Is there a book in your future?
That's great. So as I just said, I'm in a transition time, and I'm figuring out what this means. That I'm sort of moving from one audience to another educationally. Also, and the question is, what's that mean in terms of content, and what's that means in terms of the best way to get the message across? I actually just there's a Jewish holiday coming up in about a month from now called Tu B'Shvat, a minor holiday, and I just worked with the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, and an organization called Shalom Learning to write a curriculum for hundreds of Jewish educational institutions across North America, which for me that is almost more valuable than say writing a book. You know, there's a story about a Hasidic rabbi. His name is the rabbi from Kutsk, and he said, "When are you going to write a book?" He never wrote a book in his life. He said, "What am I going to do? I'm going to write a book. And when are people going to have time to read it? People are very busy. So the only time they'll have time to read it is Friday night after their Sabbath dinner. And they're going to be tired and they'll be lying on the couch and they're going to read a couple passages, but they're going to be so tired from working, they're going to fall asleep and they're going to drop the book on the floor. So what? I should write a book so they drop it on the floor." So for me, I hope that even I'm not saying that all books get dropped on the floor, but I am trying to think about if I want to reach a large community, what are the best ways to do it? And a book might be the answer, and what the content of that book would be is a good question. But this is all very new to me, this sort of new stage I'm in. So it's something I'll have to think about over time.
Well, great. My last question. What's the most important thing you have learned in your life?
Most important thing. So I'm assuming you're not asking for like a practical skill, like to
No,
walk or make scrambled eggs, which is
no.
a very
Well,
useful
that
skill.
may be important. Yes.
Yeah. I think something that I don't know if this is the most important thing I've learned in my life, but this is sort of the most important thing I'm trying to incorporate into my life recently is that people like to talk when they like to listen, and it's a great thing to just let them do that. And sometimes in conversations with people, or maybe usually in conversations with people, um, best to probably play the role that you're playing with me right now, which is to ask prompting questions, get people to talk. I think for myself, especially as a teacher, I think I have so many interesting things to say. And when somebody meets me, obviously they want to hear me blab on, but actually that's not what they want. And by listening to other people and letting them talk, I could learn a lot more. I already know what I think, so I don't have to, for my own sake, I don't have to speak. But to make space for other people and listen, I think that's something that I'm really trying to incorporate into my life.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. That has been a wonderful, stimulating, and informative conversation. And I wish you continued good luck. Before we leave, I just want to tell our listeners that my next guest will be Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, founded by astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell 50 years ago after the Apollo 14 mission. We shall explore with him consciousness, presentiment, and psychic espionage and related subjects. Thank you for listening, and thank you once again, Rabbi, sorry.
Maybe that's on my agenda too. We'll see.
Maybe that's your next incarnation. Take care of yourself, and let's keep in touch.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.